All right, I think we have enough people. Let's just get started. So we're happy to have Zack this week to talk about controllable TTS, specifically controlling prosody with insufficient context. And so Zack is, well, he just finished his PhD. Today literally is his last day. And he will be graduating from the University of Edinburgh, working with Simon King on various aspects of prosody and TTS. And today he's going to talk, he's going to share some of his findings during his PhD. So Zack, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Not finished writing yet, so not home free quite yet, but very close. Yeah, thank you. So today the work that I'm going to be presenting is 3 different papers from my PhD. And my whole sort of PhD thesis is focused around, prosody and TTS, but focused around being able to produce multiple different renditions of a sentence. So when humans speak, we're going to be able to change how we perform a given sentence, and our TTS model should be able to do that too. In the first paper, you'll actually see that if we don't do this, we end up having issues with average prosody, and we just have problems with the prosody. The other thing that I focused on is the use of context in speech synthesis models. We often have not enough information to determine what prosody should be used, what prosody is appropriate, and that creates some difficult challenges, and I look at how that can be resolved, whether you have more context or not. So I'll first talk a bit about my perspective on prosody and context for TTS, and then I'll go through 3 different papers. The first will be on average prosody and showing that problem exists and why it exists and how we can solve it. And then I'll look at interpretability in a discrete representation of prosody. And then I'll look at introducing context in order to predict appropriate prosody in the final paper. So prosody and context. Speech is made up of 2 different channels of information. So we've got the lexical content, which is the words. This might be the sequence of phones or characters, depending on what we're doing. And speech also has a channel of prosodic information. And this can be used to carry a separate stream of meaningful information. This could be through phrasing, timing, and rhythm. It could be through pitch, intonation, prominence, different things like that. It could also be through loudness. We have, what you said, pausing. There's voice quality. Aspects of emotion can be portrayed through prosody as well. There's lots of different paralinguistic things, but essentially speech is formed of 2 very rich channels of information. There's written language, but there's also this prosodic component that we can use to convey more information. In text-to-speech, we are modeling the lexical content really well. So naturalness is almost reaching parity with human speech, but the prosodic content is much worse. Part of the problem for this is that it's hard to evaluate, so we can't even know how good or bad it is. But in reality, if you listen to any of your phones speak to you, or if you listen to any of the state-of-the-art voices, the prosody is lacking. Often you might describe it as average prosody or boring, or maybe it's meaningless, so it doesn't carry any extra information through this channel, this communication channel of prosody. And one of the reasons that we've ended up in a situation like this, for one, it's a difficult problem, but the other is all of these systems are used with isolated sentences. So they usually speak single, out of context, isolated sentences. And while you can have very interesting prosody with that, often you can get away with adding no information through the channel of prosody. So we can get away with simple prosody. We don't need it to be complex. And that's how we've sort of got to this point where we've got really natural sounding speech, but the prosody is sort of not really gone very far. Even though we can get away with simple prosody, there are still noticeable issues. So the one that I'm going to look at, and the most common one, is average prosody. And this is sort of a particular behavior of prosody where it's quite flat, and it just doesn't quite sound as, dynamic as human speech. And it definitely doesn't encode additional information. So why is it so hard? Prosody is determined by context. And by context, I kind of mean all of the information that humans use when they plan their prosody. So when we're determining, let's say, what word to emphasize, it depends on the context. So maybe what was said in the previous sentence. Are we referring to a new word, or is it already been given? Who are we talking to? So all these things can have an effect. Syntax and semantics are lower level things that play into this. So maybe we would resolve syntactic ambiguities, or semantics maybe to do with newness and givenness. Stuff to do with emotion, so affect and also your personality may play into how you plan your prosodic content, who you're speaking to, so interpersonal things will have a say in this, so the setting and situation that refers to, and just pragmatic more generally, so what we're trying to convey with our communication. So all of this could be thought of as context, and that's what's sort of in our heads when we're deciding on the prosody. Forgot to say at the beginning, if you do want to jump in and ask stuff, feel free. I'm happy to have discussion. Just means you might be here for longer, which I'm happy with. So without this context, we won't be able to know if a prosody is good or not, because prosody is, it's a channel of, it's used as a channel of information. And if we don't know what it's trying to convey, we can't say if it's conveying it or not. So it's only with respect to context that we can say if the prosody is appropriate or not. And unfortunately in TTS, the context is typically just the sentence's words. So that would just be the sequence of phones or some similar representation. We might also have linguistic feature vectors. So that would include maybe past speech information and some other syntactic structure, usually counter features like how many syllables in a phrase or so. But these are quite limited and usually just syntactic features. There have been investigations on more stuff from that. I remember a paper from Rasmus, it's quite interesting. But we may have this limited context problem in TTS, but it's not like we can just solve this through data collection. Context is not only very expensive to collect, like most annotations, but it's just very, very slippery. I mean, if you can imagine the relationship between two people has a lot of minutiae of detail, it could be infinitely detailed, and it's just very hard to pin down. If you go and look at something like emotion, that becomes very hard to define. We've got sort of easy emotion annotation schemas using categorical emotions, happy, sad, and so, but those have their issues. So it's not obvious how to define context. So just going out and collecting it isn't a good solution. It's not an easy one. So to sum up the problem as I defined it, TTS is using insufficient context, but we're never going to be able to fully transcribe or add all the prosodic context a human would have access to. And this leads us to essentially where we started. There is going to be some unexplained prosody. It's the situation we have at the moment. And even if we got more context, there'd still be more unexplained prosody. So we need to somehow deal with this problem more generally. And right now, TTS ignores prosody, and that in a specific way, it leads to average prosody, which I'll talk about specifically. And more generally, we need to know how to control prosody when it doesn't have context that explains it. So the way I'm approaching this is, like I just said, controlling prosody. We need to factor, or I want to factor out prosody and do one of two things with it. So we've got this control mechanism, this prosody representation of some form. Either we want to expose it to a human user, so we have some human in the loop system, either for quality assurance, or maybe a human director is changing the prosody and choosing what it should be like. In that case, it needs to be interpretable. It needs to be usable, otherwise it's just going to be very slow and not a great system. Or if we want to productionize something, imagine your personal assistant, we're not going to want to rely on humans in the loop. It's just infeasible. It's not scalable. So we want to be able to automatically predict prosody. So given we factored out the prosody, we want to then use context to predict that. And there will always be some amount of unpredictable prosody, but we can handle that when we predict it. We can have uncertainty modeled in the prosody prediction. Okay, so moving on to the first piece of work, the first paper. In this, I'm looking at average prosody, which is the behavior it's sort of the perceptual behavior of when you hear the speech and it's just very flat. It's not quite human-like. It's sort of missing something. It's maybe boring or tiring to listen to. Seeing some work from Evaluation of Prosody in my lab, looking at that and how it's fatiguing. And specifically, this is looking at why this piece of work is looking at why we end up with average prosody and can solve that. So I do demonstrate that average prosody exists, which hasn't been done before, but I'm specifically looking at how we can fix that. And it turns out it's due to modeling assumptions. So normally we're synthesizing these isolated sentences and we only produce one rendition. So there's one-to-one problem, but in reality, TTS is one-to-many. For a given isolated sentence, there are many possible renditions. So what this means is we're going to capture the mean of the variation. So there are potentially many renditions we could have, and we're going to capture the average of all of those. There are different kinds of prosody are continuous and discrete. So something like speaking rate and loudness may be more continuous, but intonation is definitely a discrete aspect. We've got a lot of work from Pierre Humbert and Silverman, leading it to Toby. Robert Ladd has done a lot of stuff on this, and more recent work from Daniel Goodhue on the intonational bestiary. So that's from Michael Wagner's lab, it was really interesting. And Nigel Ward's been doing a lot of stuff on prosodic constructions. Essentially, all of this work in intonational phonology is just suggesting that, or showing that prosody, that intonation does have this discrete structure. There are prosodic constructions, or whatever you want to call them. And in this chapter, in this paper, I'm looking at intonation. And if you try and capture the mean of something that has multiple distinct behaviors that is discrete, you're going to end up, you're capturing the mean of a multimodal distribution, and that might not be, well, meaningful. And that's what leads to average prosody. So by looking at a couple different systems and comparing them in the experiment, we can show that this assumption specifically leads to average prosody. And instead, like I said earlier, we need to be able to capture the prosodic variation and control it explicitly. That way, we're not going to be producing a single rendition, but we have the ability to change the rendition, which fundamentally kind of fixes this one-to-one assumption, which is also similar to the capturing the mean assumption. For anyone interested in the technical side, the assumption itself is that we're modeling with mean squared error, and that's equivalent to maximum likelihood estimation for a Gaussian with unknown variance. So we're essentially assuming the data is unimodal when, as I was just saying with intonational phonology, it's actually multimodal or discrete. So for the actual method, we're using a variational autoencoder. This model is somewhat similar to the Chive model from Google. They also model C0 and duration. Here I'm looking at intonation. And this is learning an unsupervised representation of intonation, of prosody. If you're not familiar with a VAE, it's basically an autoencoder, but we're also learning the uncertainty in the latent space. So we're learning a distribution embedding the latent space. One important detail with VAEs is that we enforce a prior. So in typical VAEs, you use a zero mean unit variance Gaussian, is written there. And this gives two characteristics to the latent space. You're enforcing smoothness and you're enforcing unimodality. So the smoothness is helpful to a lot of different studies because it allows you to interpolation and a few different things. It means you know that things near the center will be more likely, things towards the ends of the distribution of the prior will be less likely. And the unimodality is, well, it's an assumption. It's not good or bad without knowing what the data actually is. So in this case, the uniform distribution could be a problem, but we're using this prior to explicitly show that unimodality can lead to this average prosody. So the question here, though, is how do we synthesize with this model? Because it takes F0 as input. And simply, we can chop off the encoder and we can synthesize from the prior. And this means we don't need to rely on F0, and we can just pick samples Z tilde from the prior. There are lots of different ways we could do this. Since we got a context, any of the points in the prior should correspond to something that is appropriate, since there isn't really a definition of appropriateness. We could sample from the center, which would correspond to the most likely rendition, or we could sample from some distance away from the center. And this is, these represent some of the systems that I'm looking at in this paper. And as you go further out from the center, you should be getting to more idiosyncratic, more varied, more unique prosodies or intonation contours. And you could go progressively further out. So the actual two systems that I look at with this VAE, the first is VAE peak, and this takes from the center of the prior. So we basically take one sample, though it's not quite sampling, and this produces an F0 contour. So these are pitch values for every frame in the sentence, and that one sample generates that whole pitch contour. The other system, VAE tail, samples from this distance, from this radius from the center it would actually be a hypersphere, but here I've illustrated with a circle in 2D. And with this method, you could sample different points on this circle, let's say, and each point would give you an S0 contour for the whole sentence. So in this illustration, we've got 3 different renditions of a sentence. And like I said, we can arbitrarily pick from the latent space because there isn't any context. But one condition is we'd need the renditions to be realistic. If the prosody is just unrealistic, maybe because a human can't produce it, or probably just wouldn't in any reasonable situation, then you'd say that it's unrealistic. This is a bit more hand-wavy, but essentially you need the model to do something reasonable. And given that, there should be situations where you could expect this prosody to be used. And you'll hear some samples later on that show the sort of extremes of what the prosody will sound like. Yeah, okay. So those are the systems. If there's any questions, feel free to jump in, but I'll just play a few samples. So this plot is kind of a heat map. There are 10,000 samples from the latent space, each of which corresponds to an intonation contour. The sort of very thin lines you might be able to see, each correspond to one intonation contour. So the darker regions are when many samples end up occupying that region. So you can kind of see some clustering at the top and bottom where lots of samples go through, and there's a smooth transition. Like I said, it's interpolatable. But we also get some modes in the middle of the latent space around here. We get another over here and a couple more towards the end and one down here. So we're already seeing some discrete structure coming out from this VAE tail space, and that'll lead into the next paper that I'll get onto soon. So even with this unimodal assumption around the tails of the distribution, we see that there is this discrete structure already emerging. So if the model almost doesn't want to behave like, listen to the unimodal assumption. So I'll just play 3 samples. The sentences at the top.
Goldilocks skipped around a corner and saw. Goldilocks skipped around a corner and saw. Goldilocks skipped around a corner and saw.
So I hope you can hear there is some difference there, but it's not like we're producing vastly different versions of a sentence, and part of that is because we're only generating pitch. So in the evaluation, we use children's audiobook data. I've not put much information about that on the slides, but this paper and the next one, we're working with the Osborne data from Blizzard 2017 onwards, or for a few years. And there are 2 different evaluations I perform. One of them was naturalness, and this is simply to measure how good they are, but specifically it should separate indicate any models that are producing unrealistic prosody. It won't distinguish if the model is worse because of unrealistic prosody or unnatural speech, but it should show if something has sacrificed its quality in some way, or if it's improved its quality. It's possible that by generating more varied prosody that you'd either get higher naturalness because it's more like human speech, or you might get lower naturalness because it's doing unrealistic things. So in the more interesting or more custom evaluation is the variance test. So in this, I basically take pairwise comparisons of 6 different systems. So there are 15 comparisons, 15 A-B comparisons. And we ask, which has more varied intonation? So we take for one sentence, 2 different renditions, one from each of these 2 systems that are being compared. And we'd ask which is more varied. And it should separate out models that are producing more flat versus more varied intonation. And we'll be able to see if the average intonation or average prosody models are producing flatter prosody. So I'll briefly talk about a few of the systems. If any of this doesn't make sense, again, feel free to jump in, because I'm sort of going through this quick. But we have a lower bound, which is baseline, and this is kind of a naive method for producing what we are planning to be flat and unnatural prosody. So just to anchor the test. And this is a quadratic fit to natural prosody. So it's almost like the baseline contour of human pitch. Copy synthesis is exactly what it sounds like. It's just coded, and that should be very varied and very natural. RNN and MDN are sort of, you could see them as just a VAE decoder, but there's no latent space. So these are just going from linguistics to predicting the pitch sequence. So this is very much like your acoustic model in SPSS, but we're just modeling intonation here. MDN is included to show that modeling a distribution, having a generative model isn't the only thing required to fix this problem, since Modeling uncertainty at the frame level isn't going to fix this problem of average prosody. VAE peak I mentioned, and that's the model we designed to produce average prosody. And VAE tail is the one we've designed where we hope it does not produce average prosody because it can produce one-to-many. And then RNN scaled is kind of another baseline. It's the same as RNN, but we basically use variance scaling. We stretch the pitch control output to make it more varied synthetically. So we expect this might have worse naturalness, and it's purposely put here to see if the listening test is correctly measuring varied intonation, or if it's measuring something else to sort of benchmark things. So the results for naturalness, we see that baseline is the worst, followed by RNN scaled. They're significantly different. The four other TTS systems, so RNN, peak, MDN, and tail, we found no significant difference, but they were all above RNN scaled, and then copy synthesis was above everything else. So this is kind of as we expected. The variance scaling in RNN scaled degrades quality, and that's fine. For the variedness test, it was 15 different pairwise tests, as I said, but we can convert this into a single scale. It was really interesting figuring this problem out. I'm happy to talk about it if people want. But essentially, we end up with this single axis that shows variedness from flat to varied. There's no scale on this. And then we can look at these together. So we can take the trade-off between naturalness versus variedness and make some observations and conclusions. So first, on the left, we see the three systems we had expected to produce less varied prosody or flat prosody do so. So these are the ones we expected to produce average intonation, or average prosody, you can call it. And the systems that we had hoped or designed to produce varied intonation cluster towards the right. Importantly, VAE tail may not be all the way to the right, and that's due to a calibration challenge, but it is a long way from the other three systems. Unfortunately, we couldn't include baseline due to just the size of the test. It was just too expensive. So we don't know the scale of how much more varied these are than the trivial system, the naive system, but we can at least see compared to the upper bounds of copy synth. There was a synthesis time hyperparameter for VAE tail and RNN scaled, and we tried to calibrate that to get them all in a vertical line with copy synth, but it's difficult. Another interesting problem if we want to talk about that. Yeah, so this has basically demonstrated the average prosody from my point of view. And we can talk more about some of the results comparing RNN to RNN scaled and peak to tail, but I'll move on for now. We can come back to this. Oops, so I'll play some samples. I'll just play them in order.
She had lovely golden hair and looked as good as gold. She had lovely golden hair and looked as good as gold. She had lovely golden hair and looked as good as gold. She had lovely golden hair and looked as good as gold. She had lovely golden hair and looked as good as gold. She had lovely golden hair and looked as good as gold. She had lovely golden hair and looked as good as gold.
So hopefully you can hear that VAE tail has a lot more varied, more interesting prosody than the other three over here. RNN scaled is doing something a bit strange, but it's very clearly synthetic. It's not quite right, but then copy synth is a long way to go to get to that. So to sum up, the typical SPSS models, I mean, this is for intonation modeling, but this sort of same idea can apply there, do produce average prosody. And this is a symptom of the modeling assumptions of modeling mean squared error, which assumes a unimodal distribution. If we control the variation, we can end up producing a one-to-many system and produce more varied and still realistic prosody. And this then leads to the next two papers. So if we have this control, what do we do with it? We can either go the human in the loop route, in which case we want interpretability, or we can try and automate it. So we can look at using context to predict prosody. And that leads us to the question of appropriateness. We need to predict prosody appropriately. Interpretability can be helpful for both of these, though, if you're looking at debugging. Okay, so the second paper is on discrete prosody control. And the idea here was to look at what variation listeners perceive in the representations. And there's a lot of work on unsupervised representation learning, be it continuous or discrete, but it's not always clear what it's actually controlling and producing. Part of the problem for prosody is that there isn't really quite a clear written form. We do have the work from Toby and prosodic constructions that suggest different ways of transcribing prosody, but a lot of these are designed for annotation and linguistic study as opposed to synthesis. So it's quite a difficult problem still. So the idea here is to try and learn some kind of orthography. I wouldn't make any claim that we do learn an orthography, but essentially the idea is to learn some set of symbols or categories, so a discrete representation. And then what I'm wanting to do is investigate the interpretability of those is kind of the focus here. We find that the most interesting sort of conclusions from listeners was to do with what kind of prosody related changes were perceived. So were they more affect related? Were they more related to information structure or dialogue structure? The recording will be available, on YouTube. Joe, just check the chat. Okay, before I talk about the models, I think it's important just to talk about domain. So this is like the unit length of the representation. In the previous paper, we used sentence level control. However, sentences can contain an arbitrary amount of prosodic information, but the representations capture a fixed amount of information for their unit length. Prosody operates at the syllable or intonational phrase level, the two kind of domains that would work for that. So working at the sentence level doesn't necessarily make sense. There could be multiple phrases in one sentence. From Xinwang's work with VQVAE for F0, we've seen in Japanese very clearly that for mora, syllable, word, phrase, and sentence level representations, it's very clear that the domain you choose, the level of the unit length of the representation directly affects its ability to capture, directly affects how much information it captures. So like I was saying, these representations capture a limited amount of information. That's very clear in his work. Ideally, we would use the prosodic phrase, but we don't, well, for one, we don't have them in our data. Two, it's expensive to collect. And then there's also the problem of deciding on phrasing at synthesis time. Predicting prosodic phrasing is kind of a core problem in prosody modeling. So that would be its whole, the whole another kettle of fish of trying to do prosodic phrase segmentation or prediction at synthesis time. We could use syntactic structure, but there are some mismatches there. So we essentially use a heuristic text-based parser. It's called Chinks and Chunks from Mark Lieberman, if anyone's interested. And it basically takes advantage of the content and function word structure in English. If anyone wants to know more, we can talk about it later. So to explain the model, I'll start with something more familiar to you. So the VAE that we saw in the previous paper, the change here is that we now have multiple representations in the embedding space. So for one F0 contour, in this case, it's a sentence with 3 phrases. We embed that to 3 approximate posterior distributions in yellow, and then we sample from each of those and decode. So we generate a sentence from each of the phrase representations. The actual proposed system uses a different prior. So there are quite a few details about how this is created, are really interesting, but all that's important here is that it uses a GMM prior. So this is a multimodal assumption that we're saying that the F0 has a multimodal structure. The question again, like last time, is how do we synthesize? Oh, sorry, hold on. There are other works that look at this. So there's Global Style Tokens tries to do some sort of discrete representations, but it's a bit unclear if they are discrete or if they're just weights. Xinwang did some nice work with that I mentioned earlier on the previous slide with F0 modeling and VQVE, and there has been VQ WAV2VEC from Facebook, but I think the discreteness there is within the model, not in the output of the model. So it might not be completely clear how to utilize this, but I think that would make quite an interesting investigation. So given that we have this multimodal prior, by using the reverse KL divergence, we essentially encourage each of the normal distributions, the approximate posterior in yellow, to come from one of the components of the GMM. So we're basically saying pick one of the components that your prosody is described by. And the question is then, how do we synthesize from this? And this might look quite complicated. I won't explain too much of it, but well, on the previous slide, we had 4 different components of the GMM. Here, with the 3-phrase sentence, we just pick different components. So maybe we take component 1, then component 3, and then component 1 again. We could reuse things. We just take the mean of each component. So on the far right in purple, we've got mu UK. So this corresponds to taking the mean of a component, and we do it for each of the phrases, and that allows us to then decode and generate. So we're not sampling from the distributions, but we could do, just not investigating that here. So this allows us to synthesize without the input F0. I'll just illustrate 4 different renditions. So this is where for a single phrase sentence, the sentence at the top is "I'm sorry." We use a different component for each of these images and figures and samples. So I'll just play them clockwise.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
So there's some changes there with especially the pitch at the end. And as we'll see with the results later, part of that is due to the data that we're using has a lot of rising intonation at end of sentences, but questioning or just very expressive kind of children's audiobook data. So how do we evaluate it? I won't go into the detail of the first one so much, but basically, given we have 20 intonation codes for the system, 20 components, the question is, do these correspond to perceptually different intonation? So we performed a test where we took one sentence and we had 2 renditions shown to the listener, and we asked, do these correspond to different intonation, yes or no? And this allowed us to find which pairs of codes were consistently distinct. In this test, we compared to a baseline using an autoencoder and k-means clustering, and we found that the proposed system using a GMM prior, a VAMP prior it's called, Variational Mixture of Posteriors, I didn't say earlier, but the model using this multimodal prior produces more distinct codes. Given the codes that are distinct, we can then ask users what their perceived perception of these are. So we performed qualitative interviews, so one-on-one interviews with participants, and we presented, there were 12 sentences used in the test. We presented 2 renditions of each sentence on 1 page. So they would have 24 samples. They knew that all the ones, let's say, in the left column were for one condition, and that was one of the codes in the pair, one of the components. And all the samples in the right column were for another condition, and that is what the other code in the other component in the pair that was evaluated in the first test. So we allowed the listeners to comment on whatever aspects they thought were important. In a pilot test, in a pilot interview, we did try not biasing listeners, but suggesting things to listeners. So saying to them, you can comment on emotion or on this or that, you're not required to, but we found that this did bias them. So in the test, we tried very much to not suggest what they had to comment on. They were free to comment on comparing 2 pairs or looking at a single rendition on its own. They didn't have to comment on everything. They would only say things when they thought there was something to be said. The only intervention was if something wasn't clearly understood when I was transcribing stuff, or if maybe they described an effect, like this sounds like a question, I might ask, could you tell me why? And maybe they would say, no, they don't know what it is. And vice versa, if they said the pitch rises at the end, I might ask, does that have some associated meaning? And I wouldn't push for them to make something up, but I would see if they had any thoughts. And there are 3 kind of tangents or aspects of the results that we can talk about. The first is what kind of prosodic differences are perceived. Then I'll talk a bit about the consistency of the interpretation across sentences, so how consistently these discrete representations perform. And then there was a few interesting findings about the prosodic variation that was salient to non-experts. So first, the transcriptions that are made from the interviews were obviously just long form text. I would take these sentences and convert phrases into descriptive terms without making sort of bold interpretations. If they said something sound happy, then that would correspond to the term happy. The only sort of stretch that I made was if they described the system to be, let's say, holding the floor or waiting to continue speaking, I transcribe that one into continuation rise. So having done this transcription into descriptive terms, there was a total of 68 descriptive terms across the different participants in the test and the 12 sentences, and there were 6 code pairs, so 12 different components or discrete renditions. And most of these were affect related. This isn't entirely surprising based on the data being children's audiobooks, but we found things like upset, surprise, standard style, emotional, anticipatory, sad, child storytelling style, which was a very interesting one to hear. It was very direct. Monotonous style and confused. And these are in descending order of frequency. And there were more of these as well. These are just the most common ones. But yeah, there was a lot of affect-related change, which is good to know. But again, if you know the data well, then this isn't entirely surprising. What was quite interesting was some of the discourse structure-related effects. These weren't nearly as common as the affect-related effects. I haven't put counts just because of the amount of space and time here. But we got a few really interesting things like questioning and rhetorical were perceived. Insincere apologies. The voice was found to be feigning being impressed or feigning surprise. It was really interesting. And then people commented on there being sarcasm, typical sarcasm, but also specifically on humorous sarcasm, which was really interesting. As for information structure, we got comments on continuation rise, but not really much else for that. And again, these discourse and information structure changes were a lot less commonly reported than the affect changes. And that could be partly because it's easier to comment on. It's just a lot more in the vocabulary of seeing if something is upset or emotional or something. So next, looking at consistency. Some of the codes were consistently reported as things like questioning, upset, and narrative, but these corresponded to some of the most common descriptive terms. So it's possibly likely that this was just either a bias in the data or a bias in the listener's responses, because the components that did produce these did produce other interpretations as well. So depending on the sentence, it would change. And depending on the sentence really is an important conclusion here. We found that the least descriptive sentences, so the most ambiguous ones, elicited the most varied comments. So the sentence, "I'm sorry," that you heard earlier, could carry lots of different prosodic meanings. The prosody could convey a lot of different information in that channel. There were some sentences that were just a lot more descriptive, and you can hear when listening to the voice that it's not really able to change as much because maybe it has a bias to just produce, let's say, a certain type of prosody. So for clearer conclusions, we only did this with 5 interviewees, and we would just need more interviewees, a bigger test. And we'd need to more carefully design the sentences. Either you could go for very descriptive sentences, so pigeonholing what it can do to see how it behaves, but I think it would be very interesting to look at the ambiguous sentences to see what can be perceived and what can be produced. So finally, a few just interesting observations. We only modified intonation, but we did get comments on loudness and duration changes as well, which was quite interesting. And my favorite thing that we found was some of the listeners linked their interpretations, their perception, to contexts that they'd imagine. And some listeners would describe these in detail. So maybe they would describe the "I'm sorry" example as coming from a sibling in a certain situation when they're frustrated or something. And this kind of led to an idea of, could we design a new perception study for TTS where we present the speech to them and ask what renditions they think would be appropriate. You could potentially provide a list of pre-specified contexts and see if they select them, though that could bias them as well. And if you did a free-form thing, you then have to analyze the descriptive terms or the description of contexts, and you could see if the renditions are perceived consistently as either a plausible context, or if you have a context in mind that it was generated for, if you're controlling for that, you could see if the renditions consistently corresponded to what you had intended them to. There'd be a lot of challenges here, but based on the fact that some people volunteered this information, it could be interesting to pursue. Some people are a lot less descriptive with their comments, though, be from person to person. So to summarize, this has shown that the unsupervised categories can be interpretable, though the consistency isn't great at the moment, whether that's due to the design experiment or whatever. As I mentioned with some related work, but also comparing the previous paper with this one, prosody should be captured at a relevant domain, otherwise you're going to be missing information. In this experiment, possibly due to the data, we found mostly affect-related information. And my favorite conclusion was that the listeners could imagine context that the prosody was appropriate for. There could be some really interesting investigations with the intonational bestiary data. So Daniel Goodhue's paper on this from Michael Wagner's lab. They generate, or sorry, they elicit performances from actors given specific contexts. So they end up with these multiple renditions of the same sentence, but in different contexts. You could do a reverse evaluation on these where you see if listeners can perceive the context that these should have come from. So there could be some interesting stuff with that data there. There's some really nice work from Daniel Goodhue. I can, if anyone wants any references and not put them in the slides, do just email me. So moving on to the final paper. I know we're getting to 1:45, so I'll try and go quickly through this. This paper on appropriate prosody modeling kind of takes the automatic route. So we have the problem of insufficient context. So here I'm simply looking at how do we begin to incorporate more context, allowing us to then predict prosody. So yeah, we want to predict the prosody without relying on a human director. And there's the sort of the two sides of this problem. Either without context, we can't evaluate the prosody, which isn't something that I resolve here. It's some nice work from Johanna, which is about to be published at SSW on evaluating appropriateness. But essentially, it's very hard to do that, and we don't really solve the evaluation here. But the other side of the coin is you can't predict prosody without adding context. There are some other works that do try and predict prosody, but they don't add context. So Xin Wang's work I mentioned earlier with F0 and VQVAE, they predict prosody, but they just do it with linguistic features. And in TPGST, they also predict prosody or sentence style, but they do so just using the phone sequence. Some other papers, so from Oben and Savone, they add discourse relations in order to predict prosody, which is really interesting. So that's adding context. Shubitagi from Amazon, they added linguistic similarity and acoustic consistency as ways to select prosody templates that are appropriate. And then some recent work from Pilar in our lab at Edinburgh looked at using the previous sentence's acoustics in order to predict appropriate prosody. So there's sort of two approaches you can take for adding context. One is to add more features. So Oben and Savone used discourse relations, or you can try and use wider context width. So maybe training on multiple sentences or on paragraphs or longer extracts of text or dialogues. In this evaluation, I'm looking at adding context features to predict the prosody, but there is a bit of work on paragraph level modeling that I'll mention towards the end. I'm going to go really quickly through the baselines. So there are two baselines. One is Tachytron 2. The other is Jurian Plus. This has a few differences with Jurian. There are things I don't use, but the important things that I add is this uses a single phone encoder. Just like with Fast Speech 2, this should allow the model to have richer phone embeddings as input to the duration predictor because it's trained for both the acoustic and duration loss. And also like Fast Speech 2, but unlike Jurian, the duration loss and the acoustic loss are trained at the same time. And this should allow the model to hopefully learn richer phone embeddings, but also just learn everything jointly might be better. So just to evaluate which of these baselines is stronger, which is a stronger thing to compare against, I did a preference test. These results are after removing any sentence where there were instabilities. So out of the 96 sentences tested, 20 of the sentences with Tachytron 2, with S2S, had errors or instabilities related to attention. We removed them, and then these are the results you're seeing. So even after removing them, there's a very significant improvement from Jurian Plus. The listeners were asked, which do you prefer? And this was the first result to show a significant improvement in duration modeling. So Fast Speech 2 didn't find any improvement, but since publishing this, the Google people from the Tachytron team have published their non-attentive Tachytron work, and they also corroborated this finding, and they went further with some nice work with Gaussian upsampling. But essentially, to me, I'm convinced that unless you're doing grapheme-based TTS, it seems that we should be using duration modeling of some form, whether that's with the Gaussian upsampling, like in non-attentive Tachytron, which I quite like. So anyway, this Jurian Plus is a state-of-the-art baseline, and we'll use it in the final evaluation. So you see it again on the slide. For the first system, which is the sort of the top line, and it's stage 1 of training, we add a reference encoder in the bottom left. So this is the Oracle prosody, and this is just an autoencoder now. So we autoencode the MEL spectrogram frames at the word level using a reference encoder, and that then drives the duration predictor and acoustic decoder. So this allows the model to basically take this Prosody specification from the human speech. The problem, as with all the other papers, is we've got this way of controlling it, but we're copying it from speech. How do we synthesize? So the second stage of training is where we replace what's in the blue box with this. So this is the stage 2 of training, and this is the Prosody predictor. It replaces the reference encoder, like I said, and its task is to basically mimic the reference encoder. So it autoaggressively predicts the Prosody representations at the word level. And it's autoaggressive because the idea is kind of how does Prosody transition from one word to the next. Yeah, like I said, we use word level. We can talk about that if you want. In the paper, I look at syntactic features as well, but here I'm just going to talk about what worked best, which was a pre-trained BERT model. So here we put in the inputs, we use the pre-trained BERT, and then we average the outputs to word level, and that is then used for prediction, and we fine-tune the whole model. Like with the Chai plus BERT work from Tom Kenter, we find that fine-tuning it does help. So using the pre-trained BERT alone isn't as good as fine-tuning it as well. So this is the proposed model. So it's much like Oracle, but we've replaced the bottom left with the Prosody predictor driven by BERT. And finally, the evaluations. So this was a mushroom test, and we asked people to rate based on their preference. We specifically avoided naturalness, though that might not make a huge difference. We're not adding extra context. It's not quite clear how to evaluate that, but we did we thought about this for a while, but essentially we are still evaluating isolated sentences, so it's a bit of a limitation there. And we've got the 4, I'll briefly mention first. The 3 systems on the left are TTF models using a vocoder. There's a wavenet vocoder trained on the same speaker, single speaker dataset. And natural is the original speech with no vocoding. It was kind of done to demonstrate that we're getting closer to the gold standard, which is just pure human speech, because the vocoders have gotten that good already. So the results, we find that all of the systems are significantly different from each other, very significantly in fact, and that doesn't quite tell the full story. So the jump between each system is quite large. We can look at this jump by comparing the gap reduction. So if we take the baseline as lower bound and natural as the upper bound, we can see how far the mean mushroom ratings have gone between those two. And the proposed model has gotten about 26%, so over a quarter of the way to achieving natural speech. So it's closed this gap by a relative 26%. And if we would have perfectly predicted prosody, so that is using prediction based on just one context feature, so BERT model, if we would have perfectly predicted the representation, so the best case of the system, we could have got up to 69%, so over 2/3 the way to natural speech. The way you improve that is through better representation learning. And the other thing we can improve, if we look at this gap reduction, taking Oracle as the top line is kind of the best the model can hope to produce, we can see that the model has gotten 38% of the way to achieving that. So just with this one context encoder, we've gotten over 1/3 of the way. You're likely to see diminishing returns, but essentially to improve this number, we're going to need to add more context features. So there was some nice work with linguistic similarity and discourse relations as features, but we could also use training on wider context information. If you train on with the previous sentence or with paragraphs, you might be able to push this further. You might say that Jurian Plus doesn't have BERT, so that's unfair, but we did try training Jurian Plus with a BERT encoder as well. So the outputs of BERT were concatenated with the phone embeddings and provided a decoder, and this didn't improve the quality at all. That's in line with a couple other pieces of work. I forget the names of them. I think Hayashi, and then the other piece of work is from James Glass's lab. So Hayashi et al. And then another piece of work, both tried to add BERT, but didn't find any improvement. And that's what we found with the system using an acoustic loss. So essentially the conclusion with that, comparing to the literature and with the work that I did, there's no tests on it, but maybe you take my word when comparing to the literature. If you only have an acoustic loss, any context will have a very hard time to improve prosody. So the conclusion there is that you need to add some kind of inductive bias if you want the additional information to improve prosody. It's just too far of a jump from a frame level loss to trying to improve prosody, which operates super segmentally above the phone level. Adding that inductive bias could be done with a prosody loss like I've done here, so predicting a representation. You could also predict like S0 features, so Fast Speech 2 do this, and so does Chive plus BERT. They predict S0, C0 and duration. Or there could be some really interesting work with self-supervised learning. So a lot of the work with contrastive losses, you could design a contrastive loss that specifically focuses on slower varying information. And I think that could be a really interesting way to incorporate this inductive bias that we need for prosody. We also showed that the duration-based S2S can be state-of-the-art. And then the other two things to talk about I mentioned on the previous slide is that we've gotten over a third of the way to fully utilizing the representation, so getting up to the quality of aura. And to push that forward, we either need more features or more context width. So I did try training the prosody predictor on paragraphs, and we found an improvement at sentence boundaries. So I haven't done any evaluations on this. We found an improvement at sentence boundaries, but it was only short sentences within the paragraph that was significantly changed. So smoother sentence boundaries was nice, but what we really want is different prosodic choices. For sentences that were under, let's say, 4 or 5 words, the model would sometimes completely change the prosody there according to its surroundings. And my hypothesis for why it didn't make any difference on longer sentences in a paragraph is just the design of the prosody predictor. It had an LSTM, an ultraclassified LSTM at the output, and I think replacing that with self-attention could make quite the difference. But we already had some success with paragraph level training, which was great. And then in order to improve the representation learning, you could just use better models. This was quite a simple reference encoder approach, but you could also train on multi-speaker data. So this was limited to single speaker, but using multi-speaker would be harder, but may lead to better disentanglement. The final thing that I think could be really interesting was training a multi-speaker prosody predictor. This would probably be very hard, but if it worked, it would be excellent. That would be really, really interesting to study. So just to wrap up, there are kind of these two main tenets throughout my PhD. One is that we need to be moving from a focus on naturalness, since we're getting close to parity with humans, to a focus on prosody and appropriateness. And the field really is moving towards this very fast. We're seeing a lot more people working on prosody, which is great. And we're starting to see some more work on evaluation, which is really hard. But hopefully we'll figure out how to do that to some extent soon. And then the other side of my PhD is looking at context. So we need to understand what the context is in order to try and control prosody, in order to produce appropriate prosody. Thank you very much. Sorry if that was quite long.
Nope, that's great.
Sorry if I spoke fast.
No worries. So if anybody has questions, feel free to unmute yourself.
I should have put my... There you go. If anyone wants to email me.
I can put that on the website as well.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, let me just keep the discussion going. So when you do so for the first part, when you do VAEs on the fundamental frequency, that's just purely fundamental frequency. So you're not trying to predict the duration and pauses.
No. In the second piece of work, which was very much along the same lines in terms of what we're modeling, I did train a model to do duration modeling as well. So the encoder would encode the durations and F0 values, and then the decoder would take the phones, and it was a duration transition model. So some interesting work from Gustav Henter and Srikanth Ranki. So it did model duration in the decoder, but it was just ready too late to put into the evaluation. So we did find that worked, but I don't really have any comments on what was perceived by humans. It's just too hard for one person to comment on. Mm-hmm. But yeah, in the first one, it was only on intonation.
And I suppose...
Hi, Zach.
Sorry,
thanks. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So I was just going to jump a little bit to the second part, I was just wondering, thanks for a great talk. I was just wondering, in the second part, you started talking about your thoughts and ideas about the evaluation of prosody. Can you share a bit more about that? You spent quite a lot of time on this, studying this subject. So I was just wondering, what would be your thinking on this topic? Thanks.
So you're thinking about this kind of suggestion at the end here?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly, well, that one. Yeah.
I think if I would have had the time to look into this idea, it would have probably been more of a sort of try it and see how it fails approach, because I really expect this to be full of difficulties. Trying to ask users to write down a context that this would make sense in is really hard. So if you just hear, a good way to think about this is if you just hear an out of context sentence, it's very hard to face that. Whereas if you are provided with the context, it's a lot easier to say, oh yeah, that makes sense for that. I don't know as much about the research on this, but if you want, I can put you in contact with a colleague who does quite a bit of work on this, Johanna. There's other people in our group. But basically it would be interesting to see what they did, to see what context they thought were appropriate. But you'd probably need to do a lot of, essentially, I don't have any good answers until I've tried it. I think you need to do a lot of pilot studies. So try providing the isolated sentences to listeners, different renditions of a sentence, and seeing what context they imagine. Then you could also try listing potential contexts and having them select from it, but that would bias them. And you could also do like a paired interviews where you have two participants, where one of them is sort of transcribing for you. So there are a few ideas I had. In terms of what I've I guess understood or learned from this is that ideally we need to be incorporating context. This suggestion here is saying we're asking users for their context, but like I said, that might be too hard for listeners. I'm just not sure. I would be very cautious about it. What I would be a lot more keen on is incorporating context into a much more traditional evaluation. So when you're doing, let's say, a mushroom test, like we did, there we go, like we did here. This was just single isolated sentences, and in reality, having users say if the prosody is better is impossible. That's why we didn't ask about prosody, because even though the system uses semantic information, they have the sentence, but they don't have any other situational information. They don't know what the data set is like and what it's for. So providing the previous sentence is a very obvious way to improve the evaluation. But there's been a couple pieces of work, one from Rob Clark on how to evaluate prosody with context. And then there's another piece of work coming to SSW from Johanna Mahoney. I don't think that's online yet, but they look out at SSW. And they are looking at what happens when you add context to the evaluation, because it does actually affect how the users perceive. So an interesting result from those is that the MOS results are, as MOS results, you might imagine you get about an average, well, I don't know the numbers, but essentially whatever average MOS you get for asking about naturalness, if you all of a sudden put the sentence in context and ask about appropriateness, you get higher ratings. So essentially listeners behave differently when you ask about different terms, when you change the question. So we don't know how to do it right yet. My only learning would be to say we need to add context to the evaluation.
I was thinking more in terms of, like you said, a bit of a pilot study style where you use, for example, go with, I don't know, a situation description, either in the form of a paragraph or kind of an image or like a cartoon picture to describe, because like in your example with I'm sorry, you can put so much meaning into that depending on the situation in which you're saying that. And so what's kind of the appropriate way to actually convey that to the system. So I think that's a very interesting topic.
Your idea of using pictures is great. I've never thought about that. I've talked a lot with colleagues about, and someone else has done work on this, about either using text as context or speech as context. So that's one way that you can look at it. but essentially, yeah, you're always biasing users to be like, this is what we imagine the prosody, where we show them some context to essentially bias them to expect a certain prosody, and then we ask them to select which one's closest to that. And as a paradigm, I think that's really good. The idea of using images is really cool, because essentially you're then removing the one of the problems with using text is they may attend to certain words, and that may affect how they respond, but using images might remove some of that. I'm going to steal that idea and share it with a friend. And Anton, thanks.
You should. You're welcome.
Okay.
Yes. Thanks.
Any other questions?
Yeah, my short response to that is, I don't know. I wish we did.
Well, it's always nice that we talk about new ideas during these talks. So okay, maybe I'll go for another one. So in your second part of the talk, when you're generating, when you're sampling the means in order to generate the prosody, not exactly sampling the means, when you're choosing the means in order to generate it, are these sort of, what is exactly the rate of these vectors? Are they word-based or are they frame-based?
So the representations are phrase level. So we use this heuristic text-based parser. And essentially the way it works is you say a phrase is a sequence of function words followed by a sequence of content words. So examples of the sentences would be, the two examples I've got on here is I'm sorry and what's the matter now? Those are phrases. There was sentences like, what was another example? He looked at the turnip and gasped, or something like that, I think was the length of another phrase. So it would be the sequence of pitch values corresponding to, a sentence could have multiple phrases. I don't actually have any examples of multi-phrase sentences to hand. The reason we use single phrase sentences is you don't know if there are any inappropriate sequences. It might be if you use the same component twice in a row, it's just a bad idea. And without looking at a language model over that, which is something we really wanted to do, kind of what the last piece of work works on, just not in a discrete way. But without a language model over the code, you don't know how to in a custom way, pick multiple components. So instead, we just look at single phrases. So the training data would have a sequence of these representations, one for each phrase, which would be anywhere between, I think, 2 and 12 words, if I very vaguely remember. Essentially, it was, let's say, around 6 to 8 words. It would be a phrase. And it was, frame level F0, if that's another question you're asking.
Yeah, so basically you will have a model that will be able to label these abstract symbols for an utterance. And then you can then play around with those tags in order to generate some other. And once you assign meanings to those tags based on maybe listening tests or whatever, and you can then play around and then control the output of the speech, basically.
So if you figured out, you could do prosody transfer, for example, but if you figured out if one sentence with one code corresponded to a question, you could then try that code with that component with a different sentence. The bottom figure here on screen is the proposed system for one sentence and all 20 components. So there's obviously some redundancy that there were definitely a couple components that collapse onto each other, but it was not many at all. It was, I think, 18 out of the 20 were distinct in terms of modeling, not in terms of perception. They hadn't collapsed. But you can kind of see some clustering where a few up here use the same area. There's a few paths that a lot of them follow. So this is kind of this discrete behavior. So what you could do is just pick one from each of these sort of paths and then try and do the evaluation you're describing. What the components do for a different sentence would be a lot harder to evaluate. You could essentially take the 4 paths in this one and then see what those 4 components do in another sentence. I didn't get around to doing that, but the consistency is a really hard thing. And I think if you had semantically ambiguous sentences, like I'm sorry, that are good carriers for prosody, it might be a lot easier to do this, but there were only 2 sentences that I would say are truly carriers for prosody. A lot of the others I don't think I have them in these slides. I can go find the other sentences if you want. A lot of the other sentences were too strongly defined. It was like a dialogue queue, and it was just very, not matter of fact, but there weren't many ways you could pronounce it.
We have 2 more questions in the chat.
So Helen says, how do you code intonational phrases? Feel free to speak up if you want to elaborate on that. I'm not 100% sure if I'm following. The way I segment phrases is using Chinks and Chunks, which is a parser from Mark Lieberman. So this is essentially 2 modified classes. So it's function words and tensed verbs. Feel free to interrupt me if this isn't answering a question. So the parser from Mark Lieberman says that a phrase will start with the function words and tense verbs, and it will end with content words and objective pronouns. And that's because these can act as placeholders for content words, and tense verbs can be used to start sentences. So with this method, you end up getting a good approximation of prosodic phrases, though it's definitely not going to be perfect. You could just use syntactic phrases as well, but it's, I think, the choice of the person doing this. I don't know how much effect it will have, just as long as it's not sentence level, in my opinion, is the important thing. I'm trying to figure out what else you might mean from that, Helen, so feel free to type some more. But in terms of how do we code intonational phrases, that's learned in an unsupervised fashion. So the Gaussian mixture model will capture multiple components. And when I say intonation codes, what I'm actually referring to is these mu UK, so the means of the components. I didn't really use that phrase consistently in the talk, but an intonation code is the mean of a component. Feel free to say if I haven't answered what you were asking. And then you asked, how much do you rely on vowels versus consonants for getting prosodic information? When you say for getting prosodic intonation, do you mean for predicting it in the decoder? I don't think I have too much to comment on this, because essentially I didn't do any analysis of that. The model has its choice over doing that. So the model has a sequence of, phones, so vowels and consonants. But I don't know how the behavior will work with that. Anyone else, feel free to jump in if they have some knowledge about this. But I don't have much to comment about how the model will do that. You can have a think a bit more about it if you want. Feel free to jump in, but in fact, Helen is still here, so feel free to email me later or whatnot. Did you want to ask something, Morten? Speech acts? Oh, is this for a different way to? I was going to say there's a different way to look at the phrasing size, looking at just individual speech acts. Oh, okay. So Helen said in the sense that vowels can carry the melody. I don't have any actual quantitative or qualitative experience with this. I didn't actually look into the model in that level. But the model will have the ability when extracting the representations to pick and choose information from the F0 contour. The reason the phones aren't as input to the encoder is we found that the F0 produced, well, there were two things we changed. One was that we used phones instead of linguistics. When we use linguistics, the representation, the components, captured less varied information. The components didn't produce as much variation as you see in this figure or in this figure. So we use phones instead, and that allowed the representation to capture more of the variation. That might be because the linguistics contain syntactic and structural information. The other thing we don't do is the phones don't condition the encoder. So this, to me, in answer to your question, looks like I'm wondering how the encoder can decide which parts of the pitch contour to extract. But ultimately, it does understand what phonetic information is available down here, so it can try and be efficient in what it represents. So it may be that the representation will only capture, will only represent information in the vowels because they're the ones carrying melody, but I don't know, I haven't looked into it. The model could be capable, I guess what I should say, the model could be capable of only extracting information at the vowels if it deems that the most efficient way of doing it. The model is obviously constrained to carry only so much information. So it has the capability, but I have no idea if it does it or not. Feel free to get in contact if you want them.
All right, I guess we don't have any more questions. If that's the case, well, thank you, Zack, for the great talk, and thanks everyone for coming. And 2 weeks from now, in the next meeting, we'll have Weiran to talk about self-supervised training, and then, well, no, I take it back, self-training and pre-training for ASR. All right, so stay tuned, everybody. All right, thank you. And see you guys.